By the last week of January 1888, every homestead within 9 miles of Vesper Draw had gone dark and cold, their stovepipes frozen shut with black ice, their families gathered in single rooms breathing on their hands. Elias Rourke's had not. His floor stayed warm enough to lie on. The county would later call it the smartest thing anyone in that valley ever built. They had called it something else first. They had called it the fool who ran his chimney sideways under his own floorboards, who spent a whole autumn digging a trench through his cabin instead of stacking wood like a sensible man. Heat wants to lie down, not climb, he kept saying, and people repeated it to each other laughing. Months earlier, no one believed that. Elias Rourke came to the draw in the spring of 1886 with a wagon, a soapstone griddle wrapped in a quilt, and no wife. Marta had died of the fever outside Grand Island, and he had buried her under a cottonwood and driven on because stopping felt like drowning. The griddle was the last thing her hands had shaped. She'd carved the poor lip herself. It held warmth long after the fire beneath it died. He kept it because throwing it away would have been like burying her twice. He filed a claim on 80 acres of hard ground below the ridge, put up a one-room cabin before the first frost, and learned the first winter what everyone there already knew: the valley ate firewood. The wind came off the tableland and stripped heat out of a house faster than a stove could pour it back in. Men spent September and October cutting cordwood and still ran short by March. Elias ran short in February. He nearly froze. That was when he started asking the wrong question. Not how do I burn more wood? Instead, where does the heat go? The answer was up the pipe, out the roof, into the sky. A stove threw its warmth at the ceiling and the chimney flung the rest away before a man's feet ever felt it. All that fuel, all that labor, sent straight up and gone. Heat wanted to climb, so he would make it lie down first. Mine. He drew it on a barn board through the summer of 1887. A stove set low. A flue that did not go straight up but ran sideways. A long horizontal channel of stone and clay laid in a trench beneath the floorboards, snaking the length of the cabin before it finally turned and rose out the far wall. The smoke and hot gas would travel that whole buried path, giving their heat to the stone, and the stone would give it to the floor, slow and steady, long after the fire burned down. He didn't invent it whole. He'd seen something like it once, described by a freighter who'd hauled goods in the Orient, a heated floor the man couldn't stop talking about. Elias had filed it away for 2 years. Now he pulled it out. The trouble was that everything about it fought him at once. Heat would lie down, yes, but smoke and hot gas only move when something pulls them. A tall vertical chimney pulls hard. Hot air rises, and the rising column drags the fire's breath up behind it. That pull was called draft. Run the flue sideways and flat, and the draft went slack. A slack flue would not carry smoke out. It would carry it back into the room, into his lungs in the night, and he would not wake up. So, draft against heat. To lie the heat down, he had to weaken the very pull that kept the smoke moving. That was the whole problem in one sentence, and he sat with it for a week. He found his answer in grade, not flat, sloped. If the buried channel climbed gently along its whole length, an inch of rise every few feet, then the gas would still want to travel toward the high end where the short vertical stack waited. The stack would keep enough pull to drag the fire's breath the whole crooked way and out. Weak draft, but draft. Enough, he hoped. Hoped was the word that would nearly kill him. Halloran heard about it at the mill and rode out to see for himself. Deke Halloran held the note on Elias's plow, his seed corn, and $40 besides, money Elias had borrowed to survive the first winter, due in full by spring, or the tools went back and the claim with them. Halloran was not cruel. He was worse than cruel. He was certain. He looked at the trench cut through the middle of the cabin floor, the split stone stacked beside it, and he laughed like a man who'd been given a gift. "You dug a grave in your own kitchen," he said. "I dug a flue. Smoke goes up, Rourke. God made it go up. You'll gas yourself dead by Christmas." He nudged the cracked clay damper Elias had salvaged and meant to reseat. "And this thing leaks. I can see daylight through it. I'll pack it." Pack it with what? Prayer? Halloran swung back up on his horse. $40, spring. "I'd hate to take a dead man's ground, but I'll take it." He looked at the trench once more. "Heat wants to climb, son. Every man in this valley knows it. You're the only one who thinks he's smarter than fire." Heat wants to lie down, Elias thought, and didn't say. That was the abstract shape of the threat then. A number, a date, $40 by spring. It would not stay abstract for long. The boy came the next week. Thomas Vane was 11, the mill widow's son, and he had a way of appearing at the fence to watch Elias work with an accountant's stillness. He carried a stub of pencil and a tally book he'd made from butcher paper, and he wrote things in it. Cords of wood, days, numbers only he understood. "What are you counting?" Elias asked. "Everybody's wood," the boy said. "Halloran says you'll burn twice what anyone else does keeping a stove low all winter. I'm counting to see." He looked up. "Ma says you're either the smartest man here or the stupidest, and there's no telling which yet. Your ma's a fair judge. Can I write yours down too?" Elias let him. He didn't know yet that the boy's butcher paper book would one day be read aloud in the county seat as proof. He only knew it was good to have a witness who dealt in numbers instead of opinions. He laid the stone through August. It was the hardest work of his life. He set each flat piece in a bed of clay along the sloping trench, building a channel a foot wide and a foot deep, mortaring the joints, testing the grade with a string and a stone weight so the rise stayed true the whole length. Then he capped it with more flat stone, sealed the seams, and laid his floorboards back over the top. At the low end, he set the stove. At the high end, the wall, he built the short vertical stack with the salvage damper packed round with wet clay. The first fire told him everything. He lit it small. The smoke rose off the kindling, hesitated at the mouth of the buried flue, and rolled back into the room. Gray and stinging. It found his eyes, his throat. The draft was too weak. The cold stone was a dead weight the fire couldn't push its breath through. He threw open the door and stood coughing in the yard while the smoke poured out behind him. Draft had beaten him on the first try, exactly as he'd feared. Halloran, if he'd been there, would have been right. But Elias watched instead of quitting. He stood in the doorway and studied the way the smoke moved, how it wanted to stall at the cold entrance to the flue and give up. The problem wasn't the grade. The grade was true. The problem was that a cold stone channel a room long had no pull in it at all until it warmed, and it couldn't warm until gas flowed through it, and gas wouldn't flow until it was warm. The thing was locked against itself. The vertical stack was too short to break the lock. It didn't stand high enough into the wind to pull hard on a cold morning. He'd built it short on purpose to keep from throwing away heat out a tall pipe. That thrift was the flaw. He had strangled his own draft to save his own heat, and now he had neither. So he split the difference. He raised the stack 3 feet and fitted the damper so he could choke it once the flue was hot. Cold morning. Open the damper wide. Let the taller stack pull hard and break the lock. Get the gas moving. Warm the stone. Then, once the channel was hot and pulling on its own, close the damper down and hold the heat in the floor where he wanted it. The cracked, salvaged damper, the one Halloran had mocked, was the hinge the whole design turned on. He lit the second fire with the damper wide. The smoke rose, caught, and drew. He watched it clear the kindling and vanish down into the floor, and he went outside and saw a thin ribbon of it climbing from the far wall stack. It was moving the whole length. It was working. He waited an hour, laid a hand flat on the boards at the low end. Warm. He crawled the length of the room. Warm at the middle, warm 3/4 down, cold at the far end. The heat gave out before it reached the stack. Solved the draft, and the reach failed. Every fix opened a new fault behind it. The barn cat found the answer before he did. She was a rangy gray thing that had adopted the cabin, and she took to sleeping on one particular seam in the floorboards, always the same spot, halfway down the room. Elias noticed because she'd never favored that spot before the fires. He pried the board up. The clay he'd packed at the mid-channel joint had shrunk as it dried and cracked open a gap. Hot gas was leaking up through the seam, warming that one board, cooling everything past it. The heat was escaping into the room too early, in the wrong place, and starving the far end. Moisture. The clay had held water when he packed it wet, and drying had opened every seam he'd sealed. The whole channel was probably weeping heat through a dozen small cracks he couldn't see. Hate. He'd built the thing wet against the cold, and the wet had betrayed him drying out. He spent September repacking every joint, this time with a clay and sand mix that shrank less, curing each section slow with a low fire before he sealed the boards. Tedious past bearing. Thomas came and counted the days and wrote them down and said nothing that wasn't a number. By October, the floor ran warm end to end from a fire 1/4 the size his neighbors fed their stoves. It held, for now. He hadn't yet met a real cold. October cold is a rehearsal. A warm floor in October proves nothing except that a warm floor is pleasant. What he'd built had to survive January, when the wind came off the tableland at 40 below and pulled the heat out of a house faster than any fire could answer, and when the draft in a low flue could freeze itself shut. That last one was the danger no one had named yet. Moisture again, but a different face of it. The fire's breath carried water vapor and creosote, and in a long cold flue that vapor would want to condense on the stone and in deep cold freeze. A frozen flue was a blocked flue. A blocked flue backed its smoke into the room. Elias understood, standing in his warm cabin in October, that the very thing keeping his floor cozy, a slow, cool fire in a long buried channel, was the thing most likely to let the flue ice shut in a hard freeze. The tall stack pulled the draft, the slow fire made the heat, and a slow fire in deep cold made the most moisture and the least pull, right when he needed the most pull to keep the ice from forming. Every force he'd wrestled would come back at once in a true cold. He knew it. He kept a scrap of paper and a cheap thermometer and began writing down floor temperatures against outside temperatures, night after night, learning his own house like a man learns a horse. He didn't know the true cold would come as the worst blizzard the plains would ever record. Halloran came again in November. The threat had changed its shape. He didn't come to laugh this time. He came with the county surveyor and a paper. Elias's cabin, the surveyor said, had a chimney that did not meet the fire ordinance the county had just adopted for the new school district. A chimney was required to run vertical and clear the roofline by a stated height for the safety of the settlement. Elias's ran sideways under a floor. On paper, it did not exist as a chimney at all. Bring it to code by spring, the surveyor said, not unkindly, or the structure's condemned. Halloran folded his copy of the paper with care. I told you smoke goes up, he said. Now the county says so too. $40 and a legal chimney, or the ground's mine clean. He wasn't gloating. He believed he was watching a slow, sad, inevitable thing. The debt was no longer just a number. It had grown a procedure, an official, a signature. It had teeth now that weren't Halloran's alone. Elias signed the notice of receipt and said he'd have an answer by spring. He did not say the answer would be the winter itself. The stranger came in December, walking. He came up the road out of a sleet storm with his collar up and his hands wrapped in rag, and he stopped at Elias's fence, not to beg, but to look. He studied the cabin's roofline a long moment before he studied the man, the way someone reads a structure before he reads a face, the way a man does who has watched a roof come down on people once and never stopped watching roofs after. Your smoke comes out the wall, he said. Low, warm by the color. A pause. You're running it under the floor. I am. It draws? On a cold morning I fight it. Once it's hot it holds. The man nodded slowly, like a diagnosis confirmed. Feed me, and I'll help you get it through the winter, he said. I know flues. I know what deep cold does to them. His name was Ansel Kerr. He earned his keep in a week, and Elias didn't ask his history until Kerr gave it, one night, unbidden, in the space of a single telling. He'd been a stove and flue man in Chicago. He'd fitted a boarding house chimney years back, done it fast because the owner was cheap, and the flue had leaked hot gas into a wall cavity through a joint he'd packed poorly against a winter he'd underestimated. The wall had smoldered and caught in the night. 4 people. He'd left the trade and the city and everything with his name on it and gone walking, and he'd been walking a long time. I know how a joint fails in cold, he said, looking at the floor Elias had built. I know it better than any man alive should have to. He set his cup down. Yours are packed right, sand in the clay, cured slow. Whoever taught you? Nobody taught me. The clay taught me. It cracked till I learned. Kerr almost smiled. That's the only teacher worth a damn. The confession closed in that room and stayed there. It didn't hang over the rest of the winter as a mystery. It became instead a skill. Kerr knew precisely how cold attacks a flue joint, and he spent the short December days going over every seam of Elias's channel, showing him where deep frost would find weakness, packing 2 joints tighter, and, most of all, teaching Elias the trick of the morning burn. A hot, fast fire first thing, damper wide, to drive any overnight condensation out of the flue as steam before it could freeze. Then bank it low for the day. Warm the stone before the cold sets in it, Kerr said. Never let the channel go dead cold overnight in a hard freeze. A dead cold flue in the morning is a frozen flue by the second morning. Keep an ember alive at the low end, always. Keep an ember alive. Elias wrote it on the wall. They ran a small-scale test in the third week of December when a cold snap dropped the nights to 20 below. For 4 nights, Elias banked the fire the way Kerr taught, kept an ember alive at the low end, and burned a hot, fast fire each dawn with the damper wide. Each morning, the flue drew clean. No ice, no backing smoke. The floor held warm through the coldest nights the valley had seen that year on a fraction of the wood his neighbors burned. Thomas came on snowshoes and counted. He wrote it in the butcher paper book. Cords burned at the Rourke place, half of what the Vane place burned, less than a third of the Halloran place. He read the numbers off flatly and looked at Elias with something new in his face. "It works," the boy said, like a fact he resented having to record because it made adults liars. "In 20 below," Elias said, "it hasn't met a real one." The snap broke. A false thaw came. The old-timers at the mill went quiet in a way the young men didn't understand, and they looked at the sky, and they started bringing their stock in close. The blizzard came on the 12th of January, and it did not come like weather. It came like a wall. The false thaw morning was mild and wet. Children were sent to school across the whole plains that day in light coats because the air was soft. Then by noon the temperature fell 60 degrees in a few hours, and the sky in the northwest turned the color of a bruise and rolled down over the valley, and the wind hit with snow so fine and driven it packed solid against anything it touched. A man could not see his own hand. A man could not breathe facing into it. It would kill hundreds across the plains before it was done, and the newspapers would name it for the children caught out in it. At vesper draw, the wind came off the tableland exactly where it always came, only tenfold, and it began pulling the heat out of every house in the valley faster than any stove alive could pour it back. Every force Elias had fought for a year came at his house at once. The wind clawed at the short stack, and the heat fled toward the walls, and the deep cold drove down into the stone, and the fire's own breath tried to freeze in the flue. Draft, heat, moisture, all of it, all at the same hour. He kept an ember alive at the low end. He burned a hot, fast fire each dawn, damper wide, driving the vapor out as steam before it could ice. Then he banked it low and let the long-buried channel do the thing he'd built it to do, lie the heat down into the stone, into the floor, into the whole room from below, where the wind couldn't strip it off a ceiling. The soapstone griddle sat on the warm boards and held its heat like it always had, and he set it near the door where the draft was worst, and it warmed the coldest corner all on its own. His floor held, warm enough to lie on, warm enough to live. He didn't know yet that others weren't living. On the second day the wind dropped just enough to see, and Elias saw the Halloran place across the draw, with no smoke rising from it at all. He knew what no smoke meant in that cold. Kerr knew too. They roped themselves together, the same rope Elias used to test the flue grade, the only long rope he owned, and went out into it, wading through drifts to the chest, following the fence line by feel because they could not see it. It took them an hour to cross ground a man walked in 10 minutes in summer. The Halloran's stovepipe had frozen shut, a tall, proper, vertical, code-legal chimney, and the deep cold had iced it closed in the night exactly as it would ice any flue not driven hot each morning, and the family had banked their stove and slept, and the ice had grown, and by the time the smoke began to back into the room they were too cold and too dull to understand it. Halloran and his wife and 2 children were alive in a single bed under every quilt in the house, breathing shallow, past shivering, which is the sign that comes just before the end. Elias and Kerr broke the door in. They could not warm that house. The stove was dead and the flue was solid ice, and there was no time to thaw it. So they wrapped the 4 of them and roped them and dragged and carried them across the draw, through the white, one by one, the children first, into Elias's cabin, onto the warm floor. They laid Deke Halloran down on boards that were warm to the touch in 60 below wind, and the man came back to himself slowly, staring at the floor beneath him, at the thin, easy ribbon of smoke leaving the low wall stack, at the small banked fire that was doing what his roaring proper stove had failed to do. He didn't say anything for a long time. There was nothing to say that the floor wasn't already saying under his hands. The storm blew 3 days. Elias kept the ember alive at the low end the whole time, burned the flue hot each dawn to clear the ice, banked it low each day, and the 8 of them lived on the warm floor of one room while the valley froze around them. The griddle held its heat by the door. Thomas, who'd been sent to them by his mother when the thaw looked to break, and so was caught safe on the right side of the draw, kept his tally book going by firelight. Wood burned, hours, temperatures, he wrote it all. When the wind finally died and the sun came up on a white and silent and broken valley, Halloran stood on Elias's warm floor and looked down at it, and then at the man who'd built it. "Heat wants to lie down," Halloran said. It wasn't a question. It was a man handing back words he'd stolen a year before. "So my wife used to say about a warm griddle," Elias said. "She was right about most things." Halloran tore up the note that spring. He did it quietly, at the mill, in front of the men who'd laughed, and he said the $40 was paid in full and then some, and he didn't explain and didn't have to, because by then everyone knew. The county ordinance was the harder thing, and it was Thomas' butcher paper book that settled it. When the surveyor came back in March meaning to condemn the structure, the boy stood up in the county seat and read his numbers aloud. Cords burned, temperatures held, 4 lives kept warm through the worst blizzard the plains had known, and a channel that did not legally exist as a chimney was written into the ordinance as a permitted design, because the storm had produced the only proof the law would ever need, and Elias had never had to argue his case at all. Surviving the winter was the argument. Elias gave Halloran the soapstone griddle the following winter, when the man's youngest took sick and needed warmth held long past a fire. He wrapped it in the same quilt Marta had wrapped it in and carried it across the draw himself. "It holds heat after the fire's gone," he said. "She made it to." He didn't ask for it back. Some things are meant to be passed to where they're needed, and Marta would have understood that better than anyone. The reason it all worked was plain enough to state, and Elias stated it to anyone who asked, because he wanted the method to outlive him. A tall chimney throws heat at the sky. His ran the fire's breath sideways through stone under the floor, so the heat lay down into the room from below, where the wind couldn't strip it away. The gentle grade kept just enough draft to carry the smoke the whole crooked way and out. The tall enough stack in the salvage damper broke the draft loose on cold mornings, and then held the heat once the stone was warm. And the ember kept alive at the low end, the hot dawn fire driving the moisture out as steam. That was what kept the flue from freezing when every proper vertical chimney in the valley iced solid. Draft, heat, moisture. He'd made peace with all three by refusing to fight any of them straight on. Within 5 years there were 7 such floors in the valley, and none of them called it foolish. They called it a Rourke floor, and men who'd laughed the loudest sent their sons to learn how it was built. What had been the joke of the draw became the thing they asked for by name. Thomas Vane built the 8th one himself, at 17, for his mother, and he built it from measurements in a butcher paper tally book he'd kept since he was 11. He raised the stack a hair taller than Elias had. He'd read his own numbers, and the numbers said a cold morning wanted a little more pull. And when Elias came to inspect it, he laid a hand flat on the far end of the warm floor, at the very end where his own first fire had failed, and felt it warm clean through. "Heat wants to lie down," the boy said, older now, handing the words forward. "So it does," Elias said. "Keep an ember alive." And the boy already had.